Toy Story 2 is still pretty ridiculous when you think about it. Because this is a sequel that probably should not have been this good. It started off as a direct-to-video project. It went through a famously chaotic production. It nearly lost a huge amount of work because of a deleted file situation. And somehow, despite all of that, it became one of the best reviewed movies in the entire Toy Story franchise. And honestly, that still makes sense to me. Because after seeing the 5th film in theaters, I decided to rewatch all the movies. This led me to come to a weird personal conclusion. The first Toy Story is still my favorite, but Toy Story 2 might be the best sequel. And I know Toy Story 3 fans are sharpening their pitchforks when they're hearing this, but hear me out. Because Toy Story 2 does something that a lot of animated sequels still struggle with today. It expands the world without breaking it. It gives Woody a deeper emotional conflict without undoing who he is. It introduces Jessie, one of the most emotionally developed characters in the whole franchise. And it turns a story about a broken toy arm into a full-blown identity crisis about purpose, abandonment, and what it means to be loved for a limited amount of time. So today on the Cartoon Palooza, we'll be taking a look at Toy Story 2 and asking, why does a sequel still work as well as it does? Did Pixar accidentally create the blueprint of the modern animated sequel? Welcome back to the Cartoon Palooza, where we talk animation, movies, and the emotional damage caused by plastic cowboys. The wild thing about this movie is that it feels big but not bloated. A lot of sequels make the mistake of thinking bigger automatically means better. More characters, more locations, villains, lore, explosions, emotional speeches, more everything. But Toy Story 2, it's smarter than that. Yeah, the movie expands on the world. We meet new characters and introduce a collector culture around Woody that we never knew existed. But the movie does not expand just for the sake of expanding. Every new piece of the world forces Woody to ask a harder question. Am I just a toy, or am I something more permanent than that? This is a really clever sequel question. Because the first Toy Story is about Woody learning that he is not the only toy who matters. The second Toy Story is about Woody learning that being loved by a child is beautiful, but temporary. And this is where the movie starts to grow up. But before we talk about Jessie and the emotional gut punch of the movie, we have to talk about how much better this movie looks compared to the first one. The animation jump from Toy Story to Toy Story 2 is very interesting. It's not the same kind of massive leap you see later where Pixar gets to movies like WALL-E, Ratatouille, or even Toy Story 3. By that point, lighting, texture, camera work, and human animation have improved so much that Pixar feels like it was playing in a completely different league. But Toy Story 2 is still an improvement from the first film. Textures look better, the lighting feels warmer, the environments feel less empty, character expressions are sharper, the toy materials feel more convincing, and the whole movie feels like Pixar has a better understanding of what this world could look like. And at the same time, it still has that early CGI simplicity. And honestly, I really dig it. There's something nostalgic about how clean and shape-driven the early Toy Story movies are. These characters are still built around simple forms. The world still feels a little artificial. The humans still have that slightly haunted early CG look. The simplicity does not feel like a weakness. It feels like part of the textures of the franchise. One of my favorite memories of this movie as a kid is the opening. I remember my dad putting it on and for a few seconds was confused because the movie suddenly looked like Star Wars. It wasn't until you saw Toy Story 2 across the screen that it suddenly clicked in my 7-year-old mind. You get this big sci-fi opening with Buzz Lightyear, Emperor Zurg, dramatic music, space action, and then it reveal that it's actually a video game. And that opening does a few things really well. First, it gives Buzz a big heroic moment without making the entire movie feel about him. Second, it reminds us that the franchise can still play with the genre. And third, it sets up one of the funniest running jokes in the movie, the diluted Buzz Lightyear. Instead of repeating Buzz's exact arc from the first movie, this one gives us another Buzz who still believes that he is a space ranger. And now, our Buzz has to deal with how ridiculous he used to be. The joke comes from character growth. Buzz has changed, so the situation has changed differently as well. And speaking of jokes, they do hit differently. I think the humor of Toy Story 2 might actually be sharper than the first film. The first Toy Story is very funny, obviously, but Toy Story 2 feels faster, more confident, and more packed with visual gags. One little joke that you may not catch is when Woody's put on the top shelf and he's placed next to a book that says, "Let's go bye-bye." Considering the fact later that Woody gets stolen and he's literally going bye-bye, I think that's a very clever way of putting it there. Then you have Ham becoming the tech-savvy guy, which is always funny to me. He's the one flipping through channels, navigating the remote, helping investigate the toy commercial, and somehow being the most useful member of the rescue squad. Mr. Potato Head gets to be more crafty with his parts. Slinky is still the loyal best friend who holds the group together. And then Rex is just the glue guy. He's perfect because every friend group needs to have the anxious guy who thinks everything's a life or death situation. I think of it sort of like Scooby-Doo, you got Shaggy and Scooby, or how TMNT has Michelangelo. Sometimes the simple comic relief character is the glue guy. And Toy Story 2 understands that. It gives side characters more to do without turning them into different people. Now, something I noticed in time is that the suspense in the first two Toy Story movies feel different from the later films. The later movies often use big emotional music and big cinematic action to tell you when something is intense. Toy Story 2 has that too, but most of the suspense comes from quieter, more awkward tension. A great example is Woody walking through Al's Cheeto Maze. The scene takes its time, the sound design gives you a lot more to work with, and you feel the distance. You feel Woody is trying to move carefully. You feel the anxiety of being small in a human world. Hallways become battlefields, an elevator becomes a trap, a toy store becomes a maze, an airport conveyor becomes an action climax. Peak cinema, if you ask me. But as funny as the movie is, the reason that Toy Story 2 is not just the jokes, it's also Jessie. Jessie's introduction makes a lot of sense because when we first meet her, she's a lot. Loud, energetic, intense, emotionally all over the place. And at first, she almost seems manic. Jessie's not just quirky, she's traumatized. She was loved deeply, then abandoned, put away, and then forgotten. She was left in storage, and now the idea of going back to a child terrifies her because she already knows how the story can end. And for a movie about toys, it's also painfully human. Jessie's backstory is one of the most challenging emotional origin stories in the entire franchise. When She Loved Me is not just a sad song, it's a whole short film inside the movie, sort of like the opening to Up. It tells us everything we need to know about Jessie in just a few minutes. The joy of being loved, the passage of time, the shift from childhood to adolescence, the toys slowly becoming less important, the heartbreak of being donated and left behind. And suddenly, Jessie's behavior makes perfect sense. She's not just trying to get Woody to go to Japan because she likes the plan. She's terrified of being abandoned again. And that's why Woody's decision becomes more complicated. In the first movie, Woody learns to share Andy. In the second movie, Woody has to decide whether loving Andy is worth the pain of eventually being left behind. That's such a deeper conflict. And this is why I think Toy Story 2 is so important to the franchise. It introduces the emotional quality that Toy Story 3 and Toy Story 4 will keep dealing with. What happens when a toy's purpose has an expiration date? The idea of toys not being perfect gets expanded in the movie in a very smart way. Woody's arm being torn is a small physical problem, but emotionally it becomes huge. Because, for Woody, the rip means he might not be useful anymore. He might not be Andy's favorite anymore. He might be put on the shelf. He might be replaced or forgotten. And that connects directly to Jessie's backstory. Woody's afraid of being temporarily broken. Jessie knows what it's like to feel permanently left behind. That's the bridge between them. And I think this is why the dynamic works so well. Jessie is basically Woody's future if the worst fears came true. She shows him the heartbreak waiting at the end of being loved by a child. But Woody also shows Jessie something important. He reminds her that love is still worth the risk, even if it doesn't last forever. I think that's such a mature idea for a family movie, and Pixar doesn't over-explain it. They let the characters carry it out. Now, while Woody and Jessie carry the emotional story, the side characters are doing something just as important. They're making the world feel bigger. Toy Story 2 expands the franchise in a way that feels natural. We learned that Woody was not just some random cowboy doll. He was part of Woody's Roundup, a whole television property with a cast, merchandise, a horse, prospector, and a history. I think this is clever because it gives Woody a past without making it feel like unnecessary lore. Now, ironically, they do end up doing that with Buzz Lightyear twice. For Woody, it doesn't. It just gives us enough. We understand why Woody is valuable. We understand why the museum wants him. We understand why Stinky Pete wants to go. And we understand why Jessie can't stand the thought of going back into storage. It gives the story emotional stakes and not homework. And of course you got the callbacks. Pizza Planet Truck returns. Jerry for Jerry Games appears, and he was from a short from A Bug's Life. There's references to Bug's Life like this calendar. And then you got Barbie showing up, who was voiced by Jodie Benson. And that surprised me when I learned that watching the credits, because that's Ariel. And of all the references feel fun without taking over the movie. This is Pixar building a connected identity before every studio became obsessed with connected universes. Now, Stinky Pete is interesting because he's not the flashiest villain in Pixar history. He spends most of the time in the box, literally, but thematically it works. He's what happens when a toy gives up of being loved by a child. I mean, he's already a display piece from the very beginning. He's never been played with, he's mint in the box, and because of that, he's convinced himself that the museum is a better ending for him. And that's the opposite of Woody. Woody believes being played with matters, even if it means getting damaged, changed, or eventually left behind. Stinky Pete believes staying perfect matters, even if it means never really living. This is a great conflict for the movies about toys, because it's also human. Do you stay safe and untouched, or do you risk being hurt because connection matters? And this is why the villain works better than people mostly remember. He's not just stopping Woody from leaving, he's offering Woody an emotional tempting escape from the pain of being temporary. And this is where I think Toy Story 2 becomes bigger than just a Pixar movie. I think Toy Story 2 helps set the standard for what an animated sequel could be. Before this, animated sequels had a rough reputation. A lot of them were direct-to-video, cheap. A lot of them felt like extensions of brands rather than genuine stories. Toy Story 2 changed that conversation. It showed that an animated sequel could be theatrical, emotional, critically acclaimed, and maybe even better than the origin in certain ways. This is a major industry shift, and you could feel the influence later. The best animated sequels do not repeat the first movie. They ask a new question that the first movie made possible. Toy Story 2 does exactly that. Toy Story 2 asks, what if a toy realizes love does not last forever? And this is a difference between a sequel that exists because the first movie made money and a sequel that exists because the story still has somewhere to go. So where do I land on Toy Story 2? I think it's probably my personal favorite of the Toy Story sequels. Again, the first Toy Story is still my favorite because there's something about that overall movie simplicity, tension, and historical importance that I still connect with the most. But Toy Story 2 might be the cleanest example of a sequel expanding the world without losing its soul. It's funnier than people remember. It looks much better than the first film. It gives the side characters more personality. It introduces Jessie, one of the Pixar's best emotional additions. It uses Woody's arm as a gateway into a much bigger fear. And it turns the idea of being a toy into something almost existential. I think that's impressive, especially for a movie that had such a messy production history. Toy Story 2 is not just a great sequel, it's a miracle sequel. It took a story that could have been smaller, cheaper, or more disposable, and instead becomes one of the movies that helped prove animated sequels could matter. Not just commercially, emotionally. And that's why after all these years, Toy Story 2 still feels like one of the Pixar's most important films. So what do you think? Is Toy Story 2 the best Toy Story sequel? Or are you still riding with Toy Story 3? And where does it rank now that the franchise just keeps expanding? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like animation reviews that take looks at movies, productions, and the bigger industry picture, subscribe to the Joey.T.Cartoon.Palooza for more of these videos.